The naming of swords is a curious thing. Excalibur, Stormbringer, Longclaw, or Sting. No.
Lots of people name their swords.
Yeah, but those are not the curiosities that we're talking about. What I mean by the naming of swords is, okay, why is this a long sword when this rapier next to it is longer? Why is it called a rapier? Does that mean this is a broadsword like we see in a fantasy book or something? Well, no, isn't this a broadsword? Or is this a backsword? Well, let's have a think and explain why things are called what they're called, why longswords are called longswords, what's the difference between a rapier and a side sword, and the difference between a longsword and a broadsword, and so on and so forth. Because in Captain Wolfram's Casual A to Z, N is for names. So, as you heard for the little rhyme and the little video of the swords, um, what I want to talk about now is the naming of swords, not individual swords, not special named individual weapons like Excalibur and stuff like that. But why do we call types of swords what we call them? So, for example, why is this a longsword? Even though, for example, this 43-inch rapier is longer. So we need to take you back into history a little bit. And you go back even as far as ancient Egypt, ancient China, ancient Japan. Throughout the world, basically, people would tended to use swords about this size, roughly, of various kinds. So, this long. And usually about this wide, maybe a little wider, maybe a little narrower, depends on the exact period and the exact society. And in the European world, eventually we started calling these arming swords because people would arm themselves with them when they put on their arming jackets or gambesons, arming caps under their helmets, that kind of thing, to put on their mail and go and come across, well, no, go and come across for Normandy and invade Britain, that kind of thing. What we normally, of course, now we'd really call an arming sword something that's a little wider here and narrows to more of a point, but essentially it's the length that matters. And people really at the time, and everywhere, again universally, generally just call their sword their sword. They wouldn't necessarily say, hand me my rapier or hand me my longsword or whatever, unless they had more than one. He'd normally just say, hold me my sword, hand me my sword. So when the longsword comes along, it's a little bit longer, obviously, clues in the name. It has a longer blade. It may be wider or thinner, it has a longer blade, and it has a longer hilt. So you can partly or completely use your other hand on it, rather than just being a single-handed weapon, because obviously the previous swords had nice short handles, only this size. You'd have your guard here and the pommel here, and some of them are very, very tight actually. Try them at a museum, it's like you can't get a modern hand out. Well, I can't anyway, let alone with a gauntlet on. So we have this weapon that's longer and has a longer hilt, and so the Germans started calling it Langerschwert, longer sword, long sword. I don't think anybody's necessarily quite sure whether it's because the blade's longer, because the hilt's longer, or because it's overall longer, but at any rate, longsword. You may sometimes get confused by fantasy novels of the early 20th century where Conan or whatever is described as using something like that, or shown as something with something like that. and the text will say something about it being he drew his broadsword, and it's not a broadsword, regardless of how wide it is, of course. Um, this confusion came about because of the Victorians. You can always blame the Victorians for everything, uh, because they used to have a thing like this. And they would call this a broadsword. You see this in a lot of Georgian period manuals, and you'll see the manuals for the Highland broadsword or whatever. Because obviously, compared to a rapier or a rapier blade or side sword blade or small sword blade, because small swords developed at the same time and they were narrower, they became more like épées or fencing foils, smaller, hence small sword, that's what we call those. Technically, these would be very often what we call back swords. If you're wondering what a back sword is a single edged one of these, this one's double edged. So, like the famous 1796 pattern British sword that you'll see in things like Sharp, that's a back sword, and also technically a broadsword. And it's a back sword because it's only single edged. It is a sort of the false edge is a bit this thick, and so that's why they became called back swords because it had a nice solid back. Except, of course, they also made them double edged, and still sometimes call them back swords, even though they don't have that thick back. And then eventually, of course, these developed into single sticks and became wooden weapons as well. And so you've got single stick, single sword, back sword, broadsword. They're largely all this, more or less. Now, although we'd invented the longsword by this point, next thing we get is side swords and so even though you had long swords, you've also still got single-handed swords, and of course because we now could have longer blades, the technology for making the steel has improved over time. Get to a stage where you can have longer blades, but we can make them narrower because they're a little bit thicker in the middle, and go back to having a hilt the size for one hand. And then they decide, oh, we'll provide some hand protection there. So then you get something the size of a longsword, but it's single-handed, and people would wear it at their sides. It's light enough to wear it at their sides. Generally, long swords, you'd sling it on your horse, you'd carry it across your back. Not if you were going into battle, you're not going to try and draw it that way. It's just for transporting from one town to another. If you're walking into battle, you'd just be carrying it. Now we have these though, which you can wear at your side. It's a sidearm. Same reason like nowadays the military calls a pistol a sidearm because it's worn on the belt at the side. So you'd have a side sword worn at your side, and the side sword has a diamond-shaped cross section, usually double-edged, and used for cuts and for thrusts, which is a little different than a rapier. Rapier, it's all about the point. It might be sharpened a few inches from the tip, but mainly it's all about the point. But you still wouldn't wear it at the side, so it's still technically a side sword. In the SCA fencing game, essentially the only difference really between a rapier and side sword in our rule set and in the types of non-sharp blunted blades that we use is essentially which rule set you're using it under. If you're using it for regular HB fencing, then you're using it as a rapier. If you're using it in cut and thrust, where you can actually put in cuts, and you're using it as more like a traditional side sword. If you're wondering where the name rapier comes from, it actually comes from an old Middle German word which means scratchy, because it's all about the tips. So where a side sword could be used to like cut and make big slashes, chop bits off, rapier being all about the point uh, people say, well, it's just the point can only scratch you if it's not going straight through. So essentially, it's a nickname for the fact that the sharp tip, if it's not pushing into you, will scratch rather than chop things off, and that's why it's called a rapier. There you go. And over time, of course, rapiers and side swords shrunk and became into small swords around the same time as the what we're calling the broadsword. And again, clues in the name. And obviously, there's various other types of swords as well. Um, you have your ones for different cultures, so the katana and so on. In general, actually, in China and Japan, usually types of swords are just called swords, but then they add signifiers on. So in China, a sword is either a jian or a dao, so it's either a sword or a blade, and then you'll add other words on to make up. Uh, yeah, this is blade with 5 iron rings on it, or blade on the end of a pole, or sword on the end of a pole, and so on and so forth, to get those names. So there you go. And then you have, because people have a tendency to like to name things and to like to distinguish things as time goes on through the Renaissance and onwards, and nowadays as we look back and see the different distinctions between things, we now can create and apply modern names. So suddenly you get these different things where we're going to call this a montanti or whatever. We're going to call say in the case of a sword larger than a long sword, you've got montanti, and you've got mortuary swords. Generally, I think whether it's true or not, but certainly commonly that's supposed to be because they're used for executions and so on. But when it comes to the SCA fencing, all you really need to know is a longsword is a longsword. A broadsword of the basket hilted type essentially is the closest thing in shape to rattan, to traditional SCA rattan stick and heavy, although the rattan stick is meant to actually represent an arming sword. So the rattan stick is meant to represent this, but looks more like this. And when it comes to rapier or side sword, well, you can call it either, because the practical difference is going to be in just whether you're using cut and thrust rules or the regular rules. Because in both cases, it's not sharp. Whereas historically, the actual difference would be, aside from the thickness of the section, would be that the side sword is sharpened and the rapier generally is not. So there isn't really a difference in our FCA game. So, for those of you, especially new or coming over from other branches of the SCA, those coming in from being interested in cooking or ANS or heavy or whatever, that's just a quick guide to why the things are called what they're called.